Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Martin Drive Show. Welcome back to our continued coverage of the Russia and Ukraine war. As we found out in the last video, there's a big military scandal going on within the Ukrainian recruitment department. They're accepting bribes is what we know the most about, but there's also some talks from Zelensky about immoral behavior towards actual warriors, quote unquote. So I want to get right on into the news, listen to what Zelensky has to say, and see what this scandal's all about.
Now let's turn to Ukraine, where President Zelensky has sacked all of the heads of military enlistment in each region right across the country. It follows corruption allegations. Kyiv has been conscripting Ukrainians for its counter-offensive to recapture territory controlled by Moscow's troops. Let's take a listen to his announcement a little earlier.
We're dismissing all regional military commissars. This system should be run by people who know exactly what war is and why cynicism and bribery at a time of war is high treason. Instead, soldiers who have been through the front or who cannot be in the trenches because they have lost their health, lost their limbs, but have retained their dignity and have no cynicism, they can be entrusted with this recruitment system.
Immediately, it strikes me as important that he got rid of every single official. There's not going to be a doubt of corruption in Zelensky's system. There's not going to be a little drop of bribery going on to avoid the war. Zelensky wants to run a country that has high morals, high standing, and stands for each other as much as they stand for themselves. And he did that not only by sacking or firing all of those recruitment officers, but also by replacing them with those who fought in the war but no longer can fight and likely can no longer work many other jobs due to, like he said, a loss of limbs or a loss of functionality in some regard. They can become these recruitment officers, and hopefully they won't take bribes or anything else, and hopefully they can squash the corruption. But I not only love that he fired them all to get rid of the corruption and not leave a doubt, because he doesn't have time to go through each person during war, but then he also replaced them immediately with people who are going to need the work and likely are going to have a hard time finding it. So I think he deserves a round of applause for both of those things.
And our correspondent James Wardhouse. James, that's quite a dramatic move from the president. Tell us a little more of the background to this.
Yeah, it's quite a clampdown, Matthew. 33 recruitment heads in every region of Ukraine are now out of a job, essentially, in this announcement that few expected. A couple of weeks ago, the recruitment head in the southern region of Odessa was even arrested. Now there is a bit of history here. There's a bit of a tension between these recruitment centres within the military itself, because the issue of mobilisation, where Ukraine is calling up and continues to call up thousands of men at a time for its continued war effort, it's a sensitive subject, and there have been issues around how that is done. Now, if you go on what the recruiters say, what the land forces say, they're responsible for it. They say the system needs more money, it needs modernising, and that they get a bad rep for doing the work of the military. And it seems that it's politically unpopular in the past for it to receive any kind of funding. And then we have this announcement from President Zelensky against a backdrop of pressure from Western allies to deal with corruption in Ukraine.
So we only have one side of this story, but I do gotta pause it so we're not just watching the BBC, but you're still watching my channel. So he's bringing up the important fact that there's already been tension between the military and the recruitment. It also seems like between the recruitment and politics. He said it was politically unpopular to fund them in the past. I'm guessing for similar allegations of corruption and bribery. However, they're arguing, which is a likely argument, that they need more funding and they need to modernize the system. However, with enough allegations of corruption and bribery, that seems to be, to me, a fairly easy excuse. But we are yet to have the evidence of corruption, so I'd like to continue to listen to hear, the politics side and the military side of the story, and not just the recruitment side, to form a fully formed opinion on this.
thing the country has always grappled with. But then there are also allegations from the men themselves who find themselves receiving draft papers. There are claims, certainly in Odessa, where, shall we say, heavy-handed tactics have been used, where there are allegations of men finding themselves on the front line with very little training. Now, of course, there are sizable proportions of the population who are motivated to volunteer and fight, but such is the nature of this war, there is a continued demand for troops to not just replace those who've been lost, who've been killed, but also to provide relief for those who've been fighting on the front line in some pretty unimaginable conditions for several months now. So this is quite the announcement, and it will have far-reaching consequences.
And James, meanwhile, there have been further...
The question is, again, what are those consequences? Is it going to slow up the recruitment process? I would say possibly. You know, obviously you're getting rid of the heads of all of the recruitment departments. However, he already has a plan to replace each of those heads, and I would imagine, you know, that's effective immediately. Those people are already in position to take on the role. So there could be a slight hiccup. Maybe they don't have the same experience level. However, it could also, you know, the consequence could be a positive consequence, because if the current officials were improperly enlisting people and sending them to war faster than they should, or taking bribes to keep other people out of war, then these recruitment officers hopefully will take an approach where they'll put people through the proper training, because then they can, you know, actually relieve these people on the front lines and take their place for a real amount of time, instead of just going there with no experience and potentially dying very quickly. And then also they'll be able to potentially get the people who were trying to bribe their way out of the war, or maybe the mass amount of people that were excused from the war, they'll be able to actually recruit them for the army, giving them the numbers that they need to fight. So while there could be consequences, I don't know that we know that that's directly positive or negative. I don't know that if the positive consequences can come in the short term, but I would imagine with the right planning and right steps to be taken in the long term, this will be beneficial for Ukraine.
Russian missile strikes to the west of the country. Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, so leafy Ivano-Frankivska, this region in western Ukraine, when you head that way, the war for a while feels far away. It's somewhere that typically isn't targeted, but overnight, well, this morning, ballistic missiles were launched by Russian fighter jets. One was shot down, but one of those missiles landed in Ivano-Frankivska, where a military base, we're told, where Ukrainian fighters were being trained on Western F-16 jets, was targeted. A house, we're told, was hit, where an 8-year-old boy was killed. So this is somewhere which typically feels far away from the conflict, but it's a reminder how most of Ukraine is under threat. The southeastern city of...
It absolutely is a reminder. Before we wrap up this video, I want to point out, kind of like the last video, really say it's not purposeful when they target a whole hotel in the last video, but even if it wasn't intended to kill this 8-year-old boy, Russia's consistent actions that end up killing children and civilians in Ukraine. Now, like he said, that part of the world might feel further away, but this is an unfortunate reminder, not just for myself sitting thousands of miles away from the war, but for those at home, that there's a war going on. And it might not be directly in the western part of the war, but it can reach there. It does make sense to me that they were targeting the area where soldiers were training on Western fighter jets. I mean, you know, Russia, I'm sure, has a pretty strong advantage still in the airspace. However, you know, if they get these fighter jets, they get trained up, maybe they can... Ukraine starts gaining some leverage in the air, throwing Russia off not only in the air, but they've been having an advantage on the ground. So then it really puts Russia on its back foot. So it really makes sense that they would send a missile attack to that training ground and towards those planes. It's just devastating, as we mentioned in the last video, to see it hit civilians, to see an 8-year-old boy die in his house. These are the things I believe the words inhumane and immoral come to mind when we're even talking about something as brutal as war.
Zaporizhia, even by the standards of this war, has had a miserable 72 hours where missiles have been hitting civilian buildings. Russia's claimed to be targeting military targets, as it does, but there really has been an increase where Ukraine's air defences have been tested.
And that's extremely, extremely, extremely telling of how Russia has been throughout this war. They don't mind hitting civilians. They don't mind, showing a force of power, even if they're losing on the front lines, because they have more weaponry than Ukraine does. Despite all the cluster munitions and shadow cruise missiles and all the tanks and everything that all NATO has sent to Ukraine, Russia still has a bigger stockpile, especially on call to use at this time in the war, because all the countries have to transport stuff to Ukraine, they have to approve it, and Russia is its own country with its own defenses. So when they have the opportunity to launch 72 hours on and off missile attacks on a civilian city to flex their muscle, they're willing to do that. And in turn, we have to watch civilians die who are still trying to raise their family, still trying to live their life, while hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are defending them on the front lines. But there just doesn't seem to be a principle or a moral or a care from the Russian side, the Russian generals, Vladimir Putin, whoever may be calling this. And I think it's devastating, and I really just don't expect it to change anytime soon. And I guess that's the most heartbreaking part of it all.